Hi, my name is Andrew Pudewa, and this talk is entitled, But, what about grammar? Now, I don't quite know why you would want to listen to a talk all about grammar. Some people are kind of grammar nerds, and other people are less enthusiastic. But I have been traveling the world, teaching writing classes for over 20 years, and of course, this is a question people ask me. How important is it to teach grammar? How should we teach grammar? Why don't they teach grammar very much in schools anymore? And how do you know if you have learned enough grammar? So I'd like to lead this contemplation of grammar with you by talking about 4 paradoxes, things that seem to be self-contradictory and need resolution. The 3 divisions of grammar, as I see it, and then the 2 worst and the 2 best ways to teach grammar in a meaningful, effective way. So, thinking about these paradoxes, there are 4 that I have experienced, things that just don't seem to make sense, only they're true. The first one would be this. Grammar is not a perfect science, but we try to treat it as though it is. We would like for grammar to be very neat and tidy. We would like it to be more like math, where everything is very consistent and it's almost unchanging, and you can learn on it and rely on what you've learned. But grammar is much, much messier than that. In fact, grammar is not really a science at all. Technically, it's an art. It's the first of the 7 liberal arts. It's the first of the trivium, grammar, logic, rhetoric. And being an art, that means it is something that you do. We think of, I will study and learn grammar, rather than I will do grammar. Other thing about it is that things do change. I had a few experiences that underscored this for me in a very significant way. The first one almost completely derailed me. Examples of how what I believed about grammar was maybe not in agreement with what someone else believed about grammar. So way back 25 years ago when I started this Institute for Excellence in Writing, I actually had to print flyers and mail them out. This was pre-internet days, if you can believe it. And so I made a flyer and I designed it and I printed it and I mailed it out to a couple thousand people, homeschool group in Seattle, in effort to get somebody to show up, to pay and show up for a seminar that I wanted to teach on how to teach writing. And on the front page of this flyer, I had written something like, this seminar will be good for ... And then underneath it, I had all of the categories. So ... homeschool parents, ... tutors and teachers, ... college students. And then I put ... anyone wanting to improve their writing. Well, you got to remember, this was 25 years ago, before that particular construction is now used to avoid the problem of having to say his or her, and it's much more common now. But 25 years ago, I received back in the mail from an anonymous person, probably, I would guess, from the handwriting, an elderly man, my flyer. He had circled anyone and there, and then written a little note, you are so stupid, you cannot get your pronoun to agree with your antecedent. You shouldn't be teaching writing to anyone. And this was just devastating to me. I thought, oh, I'm so stupid. I can't get my pronoun to agree with my antecedent. And I cried in my beer, and I crawled under my bed amongst the dust balls, and I curled up in the fetal position and thought, I should just quit. I should quit now, before more horrible things like this happen. I obviously don't know enough simple English to teach anybody anything. And so I was kind of, hurting. And then a friend recommended that I take a look at a book of English usage. So there's two big ones that are published. One is Merriam-Webster. The other was Fowler's. Merriam-Webster is more American. Fowler's is more British. But they're big, thick books. And of course, a usage book is different than simply a dictionary, because a usage book goes through how English has been used over time. And it has actual excerpts, examples from published English, going back, in some cases, hundreds of years. And interestingly, there was a whole page in this book about this particular construction of any one and there, a singular pronoun and a plural antecedent. And it turns out that the first recorded published use of this was way back in the 1920s, and the author was Virginia Woolf, very outspoken feminist who could not bring herself to do what anyone before that would have done, which is default to the male pronoun, knowing that it applied to all people equally. And no one had come up with the super elegant his or her all over the place. And so she put there to be gender neutral. Now, 100 years later, that's actually probably the standard usage for modern English and modern editing in most modern publications and many websites. So I thought, this was published way back then. It's been in different magazines. There's all these examples. I am not wrong. I may be technically wrong according to someone's conception of the letter of the law of it, but I am not wrong in terms of case law. That's what usage books are, is essentially case law. We have a constitution, that's probably called, Latin. And then we have, how has English been used over all these years? What's the precedent? So I climbed out from under my bed, dusted myself off, took my tears out of my beer, and said, I'm going to go ahead and do this. And I think there are many people who are grateful that I did not give up before I had started with IEW. Another example that I came across, which is kind of now become a pithy thing that people like to quote frequently, Winston Churchill, you're aware, of course, I'm sure, of the rule that you should not end a sentence in a preposition. In other words, we should probably avoid saying things like, do you want to go with? Although it's colloquial. But this idea, never end a sentence in a preposition, well, sometimes you just have to. But Winston Churchill said, this is the sort of pedantry up with which I will not put. And of course, the normal way we would say that conversationally is this is the sort of thing I will not put up with, thereby ending your sentence in two prepositions, right? So why? Why the problem? Well, it is a rule of Latin, and you should never, ever do it in Latin. But English is not just that. English is a mishmash. We have lots of Germanic short words that make idioms. We have a French influence. We have Anglo-Saxon origin. We've got the Latin and the Greek. And these systems are all competing kind of at the same time. So if you wanted to avoid saying put up with, you would just change from that idiom to a different word, a French word probably like tolerate. This is the sort of thing I will not endure. So there's another kind of rule that people have. And then another one that's just cracks me up is the split infinitive. We actually, to this day, still have people who want to do us the huge favor of pointing out that they found a split infinitive somewhere in one of our blogs or on our website or whatever. And of course, you know what that is. That's when you put a word in between to and the verb. So an infinitive would be to go, to eat, to sleep, and you wouldn't put a word in between. Well, that was a rule of English grammar until the year 2000, at which point Merriam-Webster's usage supplement to their dictionary gave a little explanation of how it is now commonly accepted to split infinitives for purposes of clarity or style. So it used to be illegal to say, it is polite to noisily slurp your noodles Well, in Japan, which is true, by the way. If you ever go to Japan, you're eating ramen, slurp, make noise, that communicates to your host that you are enjoying the meal. But it would have been wrong to say to noisily slurp. But that's the most natural way to say it, at least for people of my generation. Well, how did this change? How did that go from being a rule to becoming much more of a norm? Well, one man changed it, Gene Roddenberry. To boldly go where no man has gone before. He split that infinitive and he changed the world of usage because of it. Because, whoever's writing the dictionaries now, what were we doing 40, 50 years ago? Watching Star Trek and Star Trek reruns every day. You can bet when we grow up, we're going to boldly go all we want all over the place. So that's a third example. One more comes to mind, and this is, I think, the most humorous of them all. Years ago, I had come across a book called Enough About Grammar by Joe Florin. And it was a book written for businessmen. It had lots of cartoons, and its goal was to teach you enough so that you could use grammar, write well in the business world, but not be hindered by, what we might call grammar bugaboos or beliefs that aren't really true or make sense anymore. Chapter 2 of this book was entitled Pay Your Money and Take Your Choice. And he began the chapter by saying, I had questions about grammar that I could not answer, and so I went to some experts to try to get answers. And one example he cites in the book is this sentence. If you're listening and you can write it down, you might go ahead and write it down. Otherwise, you can just kind of keep it in your mind. It's actually a short sentence. We went camping every summer. So we went camping every summer. Well, that is a fairly average, normal, conversational sentence that any English-speaking person would write. So he had a few questions about this sentence. One of them was, what part of speech is camping? So he took his question to 6 experts. He went to 2 high school English teachers, both considered to be the best grammarians in their department. He went to 2 university English instructors, both considered to be the best grammarians in their department. And he consulted 2 grammar hotlines. Now, I have not actually ever heard of a grammar hotline, but I suppose in the pre-Google and internet days, you had to call an 800 number with your grammar quandary, and there were experts standing by to help you with your grammar difficulty. So he did this, six experts, and guess what? 4 different opinions about what part of speech is camping. Well, I might ask you, take a moment here and consider, okay, what do you think? From your knowledge of grammar, how would you label camping in that sentence? Well, one answer that he got was camping is a gerund. It is a noun. It is the object of the verb go. Okay, you could kind of see that, but doesn't feel good to me, but I can see why people might say that. So it could be a gerund. Another answer was go camping is the verb. It's just all one piece and you can't separate it. And that makes sense if you've studied a foreign language that uses different tense forms, and you might say, yes, that's kind of like an imperfect tense form, and it makes sense that it would be one thing, but it doesn't fit in our paradigm about English and parts of speech, because we want all of our English parts of speech to be lined up neatly, everything labelable. The third answer, which to me is definitely a stretch, was camping is an adverb because it tells how or where you go. So that opens a huge can of worms for me when you say, anything that does that could be an adverb, and you just wouldn't ever look at camping and think adverb. And the fourth one, of course, is the one that reveals the real confusion. The fourth answer from an expert is camping isn't anything. Wait a minute, that's not fair. You can't have a sentence with words that aren't a part of speech. That just doesn't fit our paradigm. Do you see? So what I've come to believe is that grammar is not only something that changes often from, certainly from century to century, often from generation to generation, sometimes from classroom to classroom, or country to country. So when I teach my students, I will usually say something, and if it's a questionable thing, I will usually say, this is the way I believe it should best be done, but you may meet someone down the line who has a different attitude, a different idea, a different opinion. Therefore, adjust yourself accordingly to, who you are writing for, and at some point students may end up in a company or a school, and there's a style guide, and there's editors whose job is to just be sure we keep this as consistent as possible. As a publisher, I realize how challenging it is to always be right when there are often different opinions about how things should be done or labeled. So that's the first paradox. Grammar is not a perfect science, even though we tend to teach it and treat it and wish that it were. The second paradox is that knowledge of grammar does not seem to be a prerequisite for writing well, but good writing requires good grammar. So how could this be? And why could this be? And what are the implications of this? I came first in contact with this idea shortly after I started this business, and I got the idea of, I could make more books and make more money, so I should find some books to make. As a publisher, I got the idea of a book that I wanted, but I didn't want to write it myself. And so I hired someone to write the book that I wanted. And this man, I found him, he was a professional writer. This is all he had ever done. He had written articles, he had written novels, ghost-written novels for other people. He had actually even written master's and doctoral dissertations for other people, which I don't know the ethics of that, whatever. But he was just a professional writer. That's pretty much all he had done his entire adult life. And in the conversation that we had, I said something that caused him to say, well, I don't know anything about English grammar. And I thought, hold on, you are a professional writer. Did you just say you don't know anything about English grammar? He goes, yeah, I don't need to. I thought, well, that's very odd. Here he obviously writes well enough to make a living at it, but his self-perception is that his knowledge of grammar was, I guess, minimal. I mean, it's pretty hard not to know anything, but it certainly wasn't a priority for him. And so I thought, that is very, very interesting. Why and how can that be true? And I've kind of been pursuing the answer to this question and other associated questions for many years since. I ended up trying to sell the book he wrote and then discontinuing it because it just wasn't a very good book. Not that it wasn't well written, it just wasn't the direction the company was going at that time. So that's the second paradox. You don't have to know a lot about grammar in order to write well, but in order to write well, you do have to use good grammar. So we'll touch back on that when we get to the divisions of grammar. So the third paradox is that grammar is extremely important. In fact, I might argue it's the most important thing of all. It's the first of the 7 liberal arts. It's the foundation for both logic and rhetoric. And yet, it is the most irrelevant thing you could attempt to teach to an English-speaking person. Now, let's unpack that a little bit. First, let's think about its irrelevancy to an American kid. When you say to a 10-year-old child, I am going to teach you how you speak English, it's a little bit like saying, son, sit down. I'd like to give you a little lecture here on how you ride a bike. Kid is like, Dad, I know how to ride a bike. Yes, you do, son. but you don't know how you do it. You need to understand all the biology and physics that makes bike riding possible. Of course, the kid is like, what is the point? Could I just go ride my bike? Right? We grow up speaking English. We have no idea how we do it, but we do it pretty much effortlessly and pretty much perfectly, or at least we think we do, around the age of 6 or 7. So to try to explain to a child how they do what they already do easily, it just often doesn't make sense. It's got some irrelevancy to it. It's interesting, though. I travel around and sometimes talk to people, and very often I have heard adults say this, yeah, I never really understood English grammar till I took German in college. That's when it made sense. And I think we can relate to this, because if we already know a language, we don't need to know what are those things called and what are the rules that govern their behavior. It's already there. It's subconsciously. It's instinctively there. It's inherently there. However, if we go to learn a language we don't know, now we need the information. What are those things called and what are the rules that govern their behavior? Consequently, we discover that many people's experience of learning English grammar is as a result of beginning to study a foreign language. This was certainly true for me. I went to Japan at the age of 21, and I lived there for 3 years, and I studied the Japanese language. And I noticed one thing right off is that a lot of the Japanese students I was there with, college-age students, they knew more English grammar than I did in terms of what are all those things called and what are the rules that govern the behavior. They couldn't speak English, but they knew the grammar. Then I noticed that as I started to study Japanese, I started to learn things about English grammar I had never paid attention to before. So that's interesting, because if you just try to teach children grammar for the sake of it, very often it doesn't work so well because it's just not relevant to them. And if it's taught in the wrong way, it can become something that they dislike or even hate doing, which is sad because it's so important. You could argue, I think, that grammar is the most important thing of all when it comes to education, or maybe even when it comes to life. A couple interesting quotes. Confucius, back in around 500 BC, said, "If language is not correct, then what is said is not what is meant. If what is said is not what is meant, then what must be done remains undone. If this remains undone, art and morals will deteriorate. If justice goes astray, the people will stand about in helpless confusion. Hence, there must be no arbitrariness in what is said. This matters above everything." Well, that's quite an amazing statement, essentially saying that accuracy in language is what morals and art and justice all rest upon. And of course, we do look today and see some of the funny things that some of our leaders have said from time to time that kind of defy both grammar and logic. For example, that depends on the meaning of the word is. Or, my favorite, well, we have to pass the bill so that we can find out what's in it. It's not grammatically wrong, but it pretty much doesn't make sense. But this significance of grammar is underscored in a very, very interesting, highly recommended little book called The War Against Grammar by David Mulroy. David Mulroy was a professor of classics at the University of Wisconsin for a couple decades at least, and he noticed over the course of his tenure there that the students he was teaching seemed less and less able to understand even the literal meaning of the texts they were reading. And of course, these weren't, this wasn't English 101, this was classics. These were kids who had signed up to read hard things, and yet his observation was that increasingly They didn't understand just the literal meaning. And so he tried a rather humorous experiment. He, on a quiz, he gave a couple extra credit questions. And the question was, he gave them the first sentence of the Declaration of Independence, which is 72 words long. And then he asked them two questions. Number one, do you recognize this passage? And number two, in your own words, what does it mean? Paraphrase this. So I'm just going to read a little bit of this to you because it is so enjoyable, painful, but enjoyable. And to refresh your memory, I will read the first sentence of the Declaration of Independence. When in the course of human events it becomes necessary for one people to dissolve the political bands which have connected them with another, and to assume among the powers of the earth the separate and equal station to which the laws of nature and nature's God entitle them, a decent respect to the opinions of mankind requires that they should declare the causes which impel them to the separation. So he gave them this sentence and then asked them for them to identify it. And he said fewer than 1/3 of the students recognized it at all, which is kind of, scary, I guess. And fewer than 1/3 had any idea what it actually meant. And for purposes of making his point, he gave some examples. So here would be some examples that he counted as correct. When people decide to fight or separate among countries, cities, or themselves, they should say why they are fighting. Okay, fair enough. That is, I think, a short way of saying what it said. Here's another one. In life, people dissolve political bands that connect them with another in order to join Earth and its powers by following nature's and God's path. And they should declare why they separate. Okay, still a little stretch, but the main clause is represented, which is you should say why you're doing this. However, a large number of students responded with what he called misguided enthusiasm. Here's a few examples. When dealing with events in life, one should drop preconceived knowings and assume that everything that happens for a reason, and basically life goes on. How about this one? I believe it is saying that as a group of people, everyone is equal, but when it comes to laws of nature, only the strong will survive. Pure Darwinian influence there, huh? I love this one because it's so misguidedly poetic, or poetically misguided. Cut your earthly bonds and wear the mantle of nature and God. Wield the power and declare justly your ascension from man's law. Then all shall bow before your might. And he had some that were actually just honest. For example, I can't paraphrase this sentence because I'm not sure what point is being prevailed. Politics? Nature? Now, there are more examples, and I encourage you to read the book. It's a small, still expensive, but very valuable read. And this is the statistics, just so you know. He wrote, I was taken aback by how poorly the students had done on this test and repeated it twice with essentially the same results. Most recently, in November 2002, I offered the paraphrase exercise as an opportunity for extra credit on a mythology test. 64 students of 118 attempted it. 33 seemed to have grasped the essential thought. Among the others were some more vivid examples of interpretation by free association. For example, when man loses all political structure and is reverted back to tribal and instinctive nature, man should figure out what happened, so it won't happen again. Anyway, Mulroy's book is fascinating in that he determines the reason that these students could not understand the sentence was they couldn't parse it, meaning they couldn't identify the main clause. They didn't know the subject of the sentence, therefore they couldn't summarize or paraphrase. And so he then decided to do some research, and he discovered that there has actually been a war against teaching grammar in American schools for a few decades, and that was back in 2000 something, led by no less than the National Council of Teachers of English. Now it's got to a point where there are people essentially arguing that the study of grammar has absolutely nothing to do with what is right or correct or stylish. In other words, there's no prescriptive grammar. It's not right to tell anyone how they should use language. The whole study of grammar is descriptive. Now we just study what people do with language. And even such statements that the teaching of grammar is racist, because if someone uses language differently than you do, well, that's because of their race or their origin or their demographic or whatever, and therefore it's wrong to say that they're wrong in any way whatsoever. But the problem with that is, of course, what happens is when people don't understand each other, confusion arises, as Confucius said. And in this book, The War Against Grammar, he actually goes through history and traces the rise and fall of civilizations over the millennia and corresponds that with the teaching of grammar. So it began with the Greeks and the Greek miracle, where they had two things happen at the same time that just caused an explosion in the ancient world of literature and politics and culture. That was the phonics, which they got from the Phoenicians, attaching specific sounds to specific symbols, allowing them to write words very precisely, which really didn't exist anywhere else in the world at that time. And then the identification of the parts of speech and the rules that organize their relationships. This then carried on into the Roman Empire. When the Romans conquered the Greeks, they assimilated so much that was good of the Greek system, and then the Latin language became by far the most precise language on earth. People say the Romans conquered the Western world with their armies, where in actuality it's possible they conquered more with their language, because they could communicate very exact instructions across distances. And of course, then the Latin language became kind of universal in Europe. But then there was a decline in the teaching of grammar. And there were places in Europe where you could be 30 miles from someone else and not understand each other, even though theoretically you were speaking the same language. In England, in the time of Henry VIII, there was a great deal of confusion because they were still using Latin as the language of law, but different Latin teachers, different masters, were using and developing their own systems of grammar, and so there was a disparity. And so one of the things that Henry VIII did, among many of the bad things he did, one very helpful thing was he decreed that everyone must teach from the same Latin grammar. And within one generation, the English literary renaissance, Marlowe, Shakespeare, Johnson. But it may go even deeper than that, because grammar is really at the core of language. And we hear in the beginning was the Word was with God. Well, that word in Greek is logos. And it has a tremendous more significance than just the word in Latin, verbum, or the word in English, word. That logos means ordering principle. And that language is at the ordering principle of things. And when we study something like biology, we're studying the ordering principles of life, or geology, the ordering principles of the earth. So when we look at the power of language to organize and communicate these fundamental truths and principles, there's a quote from Nietzsche that is somewhat enigmatic, but very revealing, I would say. Nietzsche wrote, "I am afraid we are not rid of God because we still have faith in grammar." I am afraid we are not rid of God because we have faith in grammar. We believe in grammar? What does that mean? It essentially means we believe that there are fundamental ordering principles of language and all things. And if we do not believe that, then what ensues? Possibly chaos. So that's the third paradox. Grammar is extremely important, but it is hard to teach English grammar to English-speaking people because they don't see an immediate use or application of it. Now, the fourth paradox here, I may get into a little bit of trouble, but I'll risk it. And this would be for those of you who are familiar with the classical model of education that corresponds the liberal arts of the trivium, grammar, logic, and rhetoric, with stages of development. This was proposed by Dorothy Sayers in an essay back in 1947, and it became kind of a core idea at the renewal of classical education in the Christian schools, in the homeschooling world. It was certainly commented on very significantly by Doug Wilson in his book, Recovering the Lost Tools of Learning. Her essay was called The Lost Tools of Learning. But she, just in a nutshell, she basically said young children memorize things very easily. They just absorb, they don't necessarily judge, but they have this amazing ability to memorize and repeat information as they are rapidly growing in their language function. And she calls this the Paul parrot, like Polly the parrot, who can repeat something without necessarily knowing what it means. She corresponds this, what she calls Paul parrot stage, with the liberal art of grammar, and says, if this is a time when children can learn easily, we should give them lots of raw information of life. I do not think that she was saying we should teach grammar to young children, especially like analytical grammar, which is very abstract. What I think she was saying is that young children could very easily memorize lots of things, the grammar of stuff, vocabulary, even Latin paradigms, amo, amas, amat, amamus, amatus, amant. They don't have to know what it means, but they can get it in the brain. They can store it. Then as they get a little older, she noted that they tend now to want to argue a little bit. They want to challenge the information that they have heretofore accepted without challenge. Now they want to, see if it's valid. She euphemistically called this the pert stage. I would just call it the flat-out obnoxious stage, but you can usually tell kids getting into this sometimes as early as 10 or 11, always solidly by 12, and they just wake up and they look around for someone and something to argue about. So her idea was that this roughly corresponds with the liberal art of logic. If children want to argue, we should teach them to do it well. We should study logic formally and give them the tools to understand syllogisms, logical arguments, fallacies, and invalid arguments. And then as they get a little older, they move into what she called the poetic stage. They aren't so prone to argue with everything, but they've collected up a lot of information, and now they understand the rules and the relationships and the laws behind things, and now they're ready to be more creative. And she corresponded this with the liberal art of rhetoric. So we have grammar, Paul Parrot, logic, pert, and rhetoric, the poetic. So this was her idea, and a lot of people kind of brought this paradigm to classical education, so much so as to even name the divisions of their school, the grammar school, the logic school, the rhetoric school, or sometimes the dialectic school. But I would say, I think we want to be very careful about trying to teach abstract concepts to children who are too young. Sometimes they can learn it, and it's not necessarily bad, but is it the best use of our time? I had, for example, one of my daughters went to a classical school, and she was in third grade, so she's about 8 and a half, and so she could very easily kind of do this kind of thing. She'd go, Johnny went to the store. Who went to the store? Johnny. Johnny, subject noun. What did Johnny do? Johnny went. Where did Johnny go? To the store. To, preposition, the store, article of the preposition, or object of the preposition. She could kind of do all that. But then if you say, so what is a preposition? I don't know. So I'm wondering, I don't think it was particularly bad for her, but was it the best use of time at that age? So, something to think about. So that's the fourth paradox. Okay, so let's talk now about the three divisions of grammar. This is kind of my construct, and there's some overlap, of course, in here. But for analytical reasons, it's helpful to look at them separately. So, three divisions. The first one is inherent grammar. Inherent grammar is that grammar which you have inherited because of where and when you grew up and who you lived with and the things that came into your brain as that was all happening. And of course, that the younger you are, the stronger the environmental influences developing the inherent grammar. I'm sure you've all had the experience of traveling somewhere and hearing someone say something, and you thought, well, that just doesn't sound quite right. But of course, to them, it was right. Otherwise, they wouldn't have said it that way. Oftentimes, you read books that have dialect in them, and you think, well, that was an incorrect usage by my standard. But it represents the way that someone in some time and place used the language. So our inherent grammar then is by far the most important, because that is what will most significantly affect the way we speak and the way we write. It explains the second paradox, which is knowledge of grammar is not necessary to write well, but good grammar is necessary for good writing. Because if someone grows up and has a very rich inherent grammar database, they will then use words according to the way they've heard words being used. And if it's correct or elegant, they will naturally lean toward correct or elegant usage. This is why I have talked a great deal, as many of you know, for many, many years, about the importance of reading out loud to children, because more than anything else, that is going to furnish their mind with reliably correct and appropriately sophisticated language. Pairing that together with memorizing language, memorizing and reciting on a regular basis, whether it's poetry and or scripture and or excerpts from famous speeches. When we memorize language, it does many things. It moves vocabulary from our passive use into our active use, because we've said that word again and again. Now we can say it more easily. And of course, historically, children have been responsible for huge chunks of memorized language, even from the ages of 6, 7, 8, 9. And I think we've kind of lost that in our culture. But if you'd like to hear me talk more about this particular subject of how to build the best possible inherent grammar, then my talk called Nurturing Competent Communicators would be excellent. You would enjoy it. It's also one of the more humorous talks that I give, and going very deep into the value and importance and ways in which to conduct the reading out loud with your children in huge quantity for many, many years. That's really the number one predictor of good writing skills in adults, is having been read to out loud in huge quantity during their younger years. So Nurturing Competent Communicators, please go check that out, our website, iew.com. So there's that inherent grammar. The second would be applied grammar. Now, this is where you take your inherent grammar and you mesh it against something, and then you make a decision about whether that fits or not. And if it fits, you'd call it right. And if it doesn't fit, you'd probably call it wrong. And so we hear something and we just know it's right or wrong. For example, if I said to you, me go store yesterday, right? You would just know, okay, English is not my first language. That's not correct. That's not standard usage. You don't have to know why it's wrong to know that it's wrong. You could, I suppose, parse the sentence and say, okay, Me is the subject of the sentence, but that pronoun is in the accusative case. Therefore, it has to be I, which would be the nominative case. Go is in the present tense, but if you went yesterday, you would need to use the past tense of the verb. So it should be went. I went. And then you can't just go store. You have to go to the store. It needs a preposition and an article in English. And so, we could explain all that if we had the analytical ability to do so, but we don't need the analytical ability to fix it. I say, me go store yesterday, and you would say, I went to the store yesterday. And that's really how we teach children. They say something, and then we repeat it back to them in the more correct or standard usage way. And then next time they say it, hopefully they get it. You do see, however, people still grow up with things that maybe are not literally correct, but they're just used to them, such as, well, him and me are going to go out there tomorrow. Okay, well, just live with it, I guess. But if you don't know it's wrong, you can't fix it. If you have that database of reliably correct and sophisticated patterns, that does not fit into that database, that mesh. This is actually what is most usually tested on standardized tests like the SAT and the ACT. There's no analytical grammar questions on the SAT. They aren't going to ask you to identify the parts of speech in a sentence. What they're going to do is give you some language, and it's going to have some blanks, and then it's going to have some options of what could go in that blank, and then you pick the best option that goes in the blank, and that's how they decide whether you have the language skills. Occasionally, there might be ones where two are possible. Occasionally, there's questions where you might parse the thing and say, okay, I'm looking really carefully at the case or the tense, or the number, or the voice, or whatever. But for the most part, the kids who do well are the kids who have that database, extensive database of inherent grammar, reliably correct and appropriately sophisticated language experience. So applied grammar is essentially when you see something that is not quite correct, not quite standard, not quite the way you want it, and then you can fix it. You don't have to know exactly how or why you fixed it, but you can fix it. And so that's the applied grammar. In the past, there have been a few curriculums here or there that have tried to teach editing skills. Probably the most well-known was Editor-in-Chief, although it was tediously dull. We have, of course, our grammar program is called FixIt because that's what kids do. They see something and they know what needs to be looked at, and then they use their best knowledge of English and their best inherent database of grammar and their best understanding of analytical grammar, and then they just practice fixing stuff. So, plus it tells a story and it's interesting and nobody complains about doing it. So I would strongly encourage you to look into our award-winning, surprisingly, amazingly successful FixIt grammar series. The third division is your analytical grammar, and this is really where you get into the nitty-gritty of being able to label everything and know all the rules that govern their behavior and get the very precise explanations of why things are the way they are, and you learn all sorts of terminology such as appositive and participle, and you know what these are and you can identify them. That's helpful as well and very much worth learning, although I don't know that we have been successful in teaching it well, probably for two reasons. Number one, we separate it and make it abstract and dry. And then number two, we force it on children before they're ready for that level of abstraction, and that causes them to dislike that subject forevermore. It would be like pretty much anything with children. It is better to start too late than to start too early. You take a young child and try to teach them to read or write before they're developmentally ready. They can start hating reading and writing before they're even doing it. Same thing. You try to teach analytical grammar to a child who's really not ready for that, they can start to hate it because they don't understand it. So better to put it off a little bit. Okay, so finishing up then, let's talk about the two worst ways to teach grammar in general. And the first worst way would be osmosis. This is kind of the method that we see in many public schools, which is don't teach too much formal grammar. Here's all the reasons why. They'll just get it. If you just hang around long enough, you'll just absorb it from the environment. Only, as we know, as Dr. Mulroy found out, that doesn't seem to happen. If you don't understand the word clause and main clause and subject and predicate, if you don't understand these words, you don't have tools to be able to analyze, consequently comprehend the language that you're reading, or construct language that will be comprehensible, if not also a bit elegant. So I do not recommend the you will get it from the environment approach. You'll have an inherent grammar, but you won't have the tools. You won't have the skills of being able to think about grammar. The second worst way would be out of context. You have a workbook. You have a thing that purports to teach grammar, and you turn the page, and it says Chapter 12, Verbals, gerunds, participles, and infinitives. And then it tries to explain these things, and it gives you fill-in-the-blank stuff or underline and copy and note stuff. And, of course, this is just so out of context that the kids do it, fill in the blank, turn the page, fill in the blank, turn the page. What did I just do? Have you ever seen a child do that? Like fill in all the blanks and close the book and have no idea what they just did or learned or remember? So that's the problem. So how do we build context? Well, the number one method that I mentioned earlier to create relevancy for the study of analytical or abstract grammar is to study a foreign language. And probably the best one is Latin for a few reasons. Number one, it's the most comprehensive and well-organized of the languages. Number two, it is closely related to English in many ways, and by studying Latin, you not only will understand English grammar better, you'll improve your depth and breadth of English vocabulary as well. Another benefit of studying Latin is you don't have to spend a lot of time trying to talk in Latin the way you would if you were studying a more modern language where the goal is to speak. In this case, you're studying Latin so that you can learn to read it, understand it, identify it, and it's really kind of the DNA of the modern languages. Spanish, Italian, French, Romanian, and English are all very much connected and derived from the Latin core. And I could go on for a while, but if you want to convince yourself that Latin is the best thing to do, there's a great article on memoriapress.com website by Cheryl Lowe called The Top 10 Reasons to Study Latin. But I will tell you, I taught Latin for 6 years, and I learned way more grammar in probably the last 3 years of the 6 years I was teaching Latin, way more analytical grammar than I had ever learned before that. And I learned all sorts of fun and obscure things, some of which I have forgotten, but it really gave me kind of X-ray vision into my own language, and that was probably one of the best benefits of doing it. And then the second best way, or I should say the number one best way, although it's the second one I'm mentioning, is of course to teach grammar right along with composition. In fact, it used to be there was no such thing as a grammar book. There were always grammar and composition. They went hand in hand. You learn a grammar thing, now you go practice it. How do you practice it? Not circling and underlining and filling in blanks, by writing sentences and paragraphs that contain those grammar things. My mentor, Dr. Webster, he said, when he was young, he could identify an adverbial clause whenever someone kind of ordered him to, but no one ever suggested to use adverb clauses in his writing. And when he discovered that you could actually intentionally use the grammar stuff that you're learning. For him, it just opened up a whole world of better writing and of style and of variety. So our system, if you're familiar with it, of course, you would know this. If not, let me tell you, we have teaching writing, structure, and style. So structure is all about paragraphs and composition structures, and we use models for imitation. Style is about word choice, sentence pattern variety, and literary devices. And all of these live in this world of applied grammar. I have met kids, honestly, who've been through 3 years of fill-in-the-blank grammar book. Come to my writing class, can't find the verb in their own sentence on the paper. 3 days of using a dress-up checklist with strong verb, they not only know what the verb is and how to do it, they can look at their verb and decide whether it gives a strong image or feeling, and if not, consider a substitute a better one. So I've had adults come to our teacher course, Teaching Writing Structure and Style, just 2-day seminar, and say, I think I've learned more about English than I learned in all of my years in college or high school. Why? Because when there's application, there's retention, there's relevancy, it's meaningful, and there's some joy that comes into it. Grammar should be the most exciting thing to study because it's what opens the doors to everything else. So I think with that information, you can understand the paradoxes that we're all suffering under a little bit, understand the divisions and the priorities of what's most important, avoid the worst, and embrace the best ways. And then you will know what you need to know about teaching grammar. Thank you so much.